The Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. Have you ever wondered what some of the greatest names in rock and roll history were up to before they were famous? Well, today we'll have a little look at Eric Clapton, Rod Stewart, Marc Bolan, and David Bowie. Some of the biggest names, I think, in rock history. They all beavered away for years before they found any real international success. Start with a look at Eric Clapton. That's got to be one of the most famous guitarists of all time. And he played with some great bands before finding success with the first rock and roll supergroup, Cream. Now, Eric was born in Ripley in Surrey on the 30th of March 1945, and at the beginning of 1963 he joined the Roosters. Now, they included Tom McGuinness, he was later in Manfred Mann, and pianist Ben Palmer. That was Eric's mate, and he pops up all over the place in Eric Clapton's career. And Brian Jones is reputed to have sat in with the Roosters from time to time after he moved to London. Well, by the autumn of that year, Clapton had moved on from the Roosters and had joined Casey Jones and the Engineers, but he was famously only with them for a handful of gigs. 7 is often the number quoted, before he moved on and joined the Yardbirds. He felt Casey Jones and the Engineers were just a little bit too much of a pop band for his taste. As an aside, but well worth noting, Casey Jones was actually Liverpool legend Brian Casser. He was one of the biggest names in Liverpool before the Merseybeat era. He owned a club called the Casanova. And he also had a band called Cass and the Casanovas. And they very famously auditioned for Billy Fury at the same session that the Beatles, well, they were the Silver Beatles at the time, on the 10th of May 1960, and famously the Beatles drummer at the time, Tommy Moore, was late for the audition, and the Casanovas drummer, Johnny Hutchinson, stood in. Neither managed to secure the gig with Billy Fury, though both managed to get other bands from the same Larry Parnes stable. Now, Brian Casser decided to move out of Liverpool and try his luck in London. And sadly, he did that just before the Merseybeat era, because it was the beginning of 1961 when he moved down. He managed the Gardenia Club in Soho, and also then went on and set up Casey Jones and the Engineers. Now, it's interesting to note that the rest of the Casanovas decided to stay together, and they became one of the greatest Merseybeat bands of the early mid-1960s. They were the big three. Now, when he joined the Yardbirds, Top Topham had been the original lead guitarist, and he was only about 16 at this time. And the Yardbirds were really going from strength to strength on the London R&B circuit, and the band was turning professional. The other members were that little bit older than Top Topham, and his parents were very keen for him not to become a professional musician, but to get a proper job. So he quit the group and continued with his studies, and Eric Clapton took over as lead guitarist. And on the 7th and 8th of December, just a couple of months later, they made some recordings at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, London. And the second day, the recording was with Sonny Boy Williamson II, absolute blues legend. Now, the Yardbirds had recently taken over from the Rolling Stones as the house band at the Crawdaddy, and both nights' performances recorded by their manager, Giorgio Gomelsky. Now, he's one of the real unsung heroes of the London R&B scene. As well as managing the Yardbirds, he was actually the owner of the Crawdaddy Club, and he was the first manager of the Rolling Stones before Andrew Lou Golden took them over. By the October of '64, the Yardbirds released their second single, Good Morning Little Schoolgirl. Now, that was produced by Giorgio Gomelsky, as most of their material was, and it gave them their first hit single, gave them number 44. And a couple of months later, they released their first album, 5 Live Yardbirds, and that had been recorded at the Marquee the previous March. But by the March of '65, Eric was moving on again. Again, he was becoming a little disillusioned with the pop-oriented direction the Yardbirds were taking, particularly their third single. That was released about the same sort of time, and that was For Your Love, with a B-side of Got to Hurry. For Your Love was written by Graham Gouldman, but Got to Hurry has a writing credit for O. Rasputin, and that was none other, of course, than Jojo Gomelski. But what I love about that single is the band credit on the label, and instead of just saying the Yardbirds, it says Yardbirds featuring Eric Slowhand Clapton, and decided that he wanted to follow his desire to play the blues. He joined the highly respected John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and his place in the Yardbirds, of course, was taken by Jeff Beck, the guitar legend from that particular time. And the lineup of the Blues Breakers at that time was John Mayall, Eric Clapton. John McVie was the bass. Now he's the Mac in Fleetwood Mac, and Huey Flint was the drummer. And in the summer of '65, Eric decided it was time for a little jaunt, really, across Europe. And the idea was he formed a band called The Glands, and they were going to be sort of roaming troubadours and play their way across Europe and possibly even get to Australia. But they only managed to get as far as Greece. And there they were trapped in a club. They were blackmailed by the club owner, basically, for working without permits. But they did make their escape. Urban legend has it that Eric Clapton lost his amp when they scurried back to Blighty. The band lineup included Ben Palmer from Eric Clapton's Rooster Days. So it was the sort of October, November that they arrived back in England. And around that time, John Mayall released I'm Your Witch Doctor, a single, and that was produced by Jimmy Page, obviously featured Eric Clapton. When Eric rejoined John Mayall after his jaunt with the Glands, he came back to find that Jack Bruce was in the Blues Breakers. He'd replaced John McVie, who by now gone off to join Fleetwood Mac. Jack Bruce wasn't there for too long, but it was the first time that Eric Clapton had played with Bruce. And he actually replaced guitarist Peter Green in the Blues Breakers. Now, Peter Green only joined a week earlier, which was rather sad. But it wasn't all bad news for Peter Green, because when Clapton left the Blues Breakers to form Cream, Pete Green rejoined as the guitarist. Of course, it was the 22nd of July 1966 that John Mayall released the great Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton album. And that lineup was Clapton, Mayall, Huey Flint and John McVie. The cover famously shows the band sitting down with Eric Clapton reading a copy of the Beano comic. And it was actually released about the time that Eric Clapton left the Blues Breakers to form Cream, and was produced by Mike Vernon, who went on, of course, to found the Blues Horizon record label in 1967. Now, if you're interested in the full origins of Cream, check out the podcast on my website, rockandrollanraveled.com. I did the complete story of Cream in a Rock and Roll Unraveled show recently, and you can find the podcast on the website. But in essence, what happened was Eric Clapton sat in on a Graham Bond organisation gig with Ginger Baker as the drummer, and then in the May-June, Ginger Baker returned the compliment, and he sat in with Eric and John Mayall's Blues Breakers at a gig in Oxford. It was Ginger Baker who asked Eric Clapton if he fancied starting a band, and Eric insisted that Jack Bruce had joined them. He'd been well impressed from the short time that they played together, and Clapton had absolutely no idea about the Bruce Baker history and the fact that they really didn't get on. Well, they did a warm-up at Manchester's Twisted Wheel Club, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st of July, 1966, they played their official debut concert at the 6th National Jazz and Blues Festival in Windsor, the south of England. They appeared on the last day alongside people like Georgie Fame, The Action and Alan Bowne. Eric Clapton's on tour at the moment, so great chance to see him. Sadly, you've just missed him. In the UK, he was at the Royal Albert Hall on the 13th to the 16th of May, but he's over in Germany, Austria, and America from the 4th of June to the 14th of September. And if you happen to be in Dallas on the 20th and 21st of September, check out the Crossroads Guitar Festival. That includes Eric and a host of others. For our first song, I thought we'd take the B-side of that I'm Your Witch Doctor single I mentioned earlier. Both sides written by John Mayall, produced by Jimmy Page. Actually released on the Immediate record label, and that was one that was owned and set up by Andrew Loog Oldham. He was the Rolling Stones manager who took over from Giorgio Gomelsky. And this is the B-side of I'm Your Witch Doctor. This is Eric Clapton with Telephone Blues. Our second rock and roll hero, Rod Stewart. He was born in Highgate, North London on the 10th of January 1945. And in the early days you could find him busking around the bars of Spain and Italy with his banjo and friend Whiz Jones. Now the sojourn ended for Rod Stewart when he was deported from Spain for vagrancy. And his first professional band was Jimmy Powell and the Five Dimensions. Now, the Dimensions formed in London and teamed up with singer Jimmy Powell. And he'd been in an early version of the Rockin' Berries and also had a handful of solo singles. Rod joined them around the summer of 1963, and he joined as a harmonica player with ambitions to become a singer. Well, he certainly did that. They parted company around January 64, and the next port of call was Long John Baldry and the Hoochie Coochie Men. Now, when Cyril Davis died, Long John Baldry took over the band, Cyril Davis R&B All-Stars, and rebranded them as the Hoochie Coochie Men. And they released a single in the summer of 1964. The A-side was You Be Mine, and the B-side, Up Above My Head, I Can Hear Music in the Air. And that B-side, Up Above My Head, was Rod Stewart's first ever recording. And it was originally written and recorded by Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And the A-side was from Willie Dixon. And Rod always had an eye to a successful solo career. And you'll find throughout this story, he's sort of simultaneously in bands and cutting solo singles and albums. And that really started back in October 64 when he released his first single, Good Morning Little Schoolgirl. And that was Sonny Boy Williamson the first actually wrote that. And it also featured, that particular single featured bassist John Paul Jones, who went on to find fame with Led Zeppelin. Now, Sonny Boy Williamson released it in 1937. And as you remember from what Eric Clapton was up to before he was famous, the Yardbirds released it as their second UK single around the same sort of time as Rod Stewart. It gave them their first UK hit. Now, Rod had to wait till 1971 for his first solo hit, and that came with Tim Hardin's Reason to Believe. Now, they parted company, Long John Baldry, the Coochie Men, and Rod Stewart in 65. But you find him by the summer of 65 in the Steam Packets, well, back with Long John Baldry. But that also included people like Brian Auger, Julie Driscoll, and Mickey Waller, who played with Rod in the Jeff Beck Group. And Rod was back in April of 66 with another attempt at a solo success, and this time it was his take on Sam Cooke's classic Shake. And by the autumn of 66, he was in another band, the Shotgun Express. He was in a lot of very interesting bands who really did not find solo success. They had a single called I Could Feel the Whole World Turn Around, and that lineup included people like Peter Bardens, Mick Fleetwood, who was the Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac, Rod obviously, and Beryl Marsden. She was a vocalist from Liverpool, actually probably Liverpool's best kept secret. She's a phenomenal singer. And then he joined the Jeff Beck group. And shortly after Jeff Beck left the Yardbirds, he formed, well, it was actually the Mark I Jeff Beck group. And that was with Rod Stewart and also Ronnie Wood. Initially, there was a fast turnover of rhythm section, involving some brief stays for people like Jet Harris, who was the original bassist with the Shadows, and ex-Pretty Things drummer Viv Prince. Now, the drummers came and went until Ainsley Dunbar joined, and he stayed long enough to feature on their first album, Truth. And there's a great glimpse of the future at a gig, the Jeff Beck group. They were supporting Roy Orbison. On the 3rd of March 1967, they opened the tour at the Astoria in London's Finsbury Park. And the Small Faces were also on the bill, and they closed the first half of the show. And that glimpse of the future is essentially the band that would become the Faces. They were all on stage at the Astoria that night, although not necessarily at the same time with the same band. What happened was that by mid-69, the Faces formed after Steve Marriott left the Small Faces, and he went off to form Humble Pie with Peter Frampton. And he was replaced by Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. And they initially worked as the Small Faces, then relaunched as the Faces. They had a press announcement on the 18th of October, 69. And again, Rod is out there seeking solo success. And in February of 1970, he released his first solo album, great title, An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down. And that includes the track Handbags and Glad Rags, written by Mike Darbo. And he played piano and arranged the song on the album. Mike Darbo was the guy that replaced Paul Jones as lead singer in Manfred Mann. And then the Faces went off on an American tour, March to the end of May. And Rod Stewart found success. On the 4th of September 1971, Reason to Believe entered the UK charts. As I mentioned, it was written by Tim Harding. You can find the Tim Harding version on his album Tim Harding 1. And it was Rod's first UK solo hit, number 1 for 5 weeks. He really had arrived. And great news for Rod Stewart fans. You can find him all over the place between the 4th of June and the 19th of December. He's at the UK, Ireland, back to the UK, Germany, Poland, Austria, Spain, Portugal, France, back to the UK, then off to America, and back to Ireland and the UK. So plenty of chance to catch Rod on tour. If you'd like the details for the dates and venues for Rod Stewart and Eric Clapton's tours, just check out my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. There's a section at the top called 60s and 70s Artists on Tour, and you'll find the details for these two guys and a host of other people. So if ever you're wondering if your favourite artist from the 60s and 70s is on tour, just check it out on my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. I thought it'd be great to hear Rod Stewart's take on the Sam Cooke classic, Shake. Now, there's an interesting story behind that for the Sam Cooke version. Sam Cooke died in tragic circumstances on the 11th of December 1964. And a couple of weeks later, on the 22nd of December, in America, the single Shake, coupled with A Change Is Gonna Come, one of his great songs. Both sides charted in America, but it was, believe it or not, it was Sam Cooke's penultimate US hit. And from 1966, this is Rod Stewart's version of Shake. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. We're taking a look at what some of the rock and roll icons were up to before they were famous. We've already looked at Eric Clapton and Rod Stewart, and next it'll be Marc Bolan and David Bowie. But before continuing with the story, an opportunity to win a copy of my book, a signed copy indeed, of Rock and Roll Unraveled. Last month's competition was won by Tim from Basildon in Essex. Well done, Tim. This month's question: who did Eric Clapton replace as lead guitarist in the Yardbirds in 1963? Now, Rock and Roll Unraveled tells the story of rock and roll from its roots till 1970s punk. That question again? Who did Eric Clapton replace as lead guitarist in the Yardbirds in 1963? Now, to enter, just go to my website, rockandrollunraveled.com, go to contacts, send me an email with the answer, and I'll announce the winner on the next show. I'll post the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Good luck with the competition. Meanwhile, back at the plot. Marc Bolan was born Mark Feld in Hackney in London on the 30th of September 1947. There are various ideas about where his name Bolan could have come from. He was known to have shared a flat with James Bolan in the early days, and maybe it was a derivation of that. Well, too, he was a big Bob Dylan fan, and some people think that the Bolan came from B.O. from Bob and L.A.N. from Dylan. What certainly is known is by the late 1950s, he was in a school band with Helen Shapiro, and they were calling themselves Susie and the Hula Hoops. Now, by 1964, he was calling himself Toby Tyler, and he recorded an acetate, a couple of tracks, The Road I'm On and Blowing in the Wind. Now, The Road I'm On was written by Dean DiMucci, and of course, Blowing in the Wind was written by his hero, Bob Dylan, and he recorded that in Soho at Vic Keary Studios in Dean Street. Well, by 65, he was calling himself Marc Bolan, and on the 12th of November, he made his first TV appearance, and that was on the awesome Ready, Steady, Go. He performed The Wizard, and he wrote that as he did most of his material. A couple more unsuccessful singles followed that, and then he joined John's Children, and he joined them in time for their German tour supporting The Who. Kicked off in April 1967. Now, John's Children were well known for their outrageous stage show, and by the time they reached Friedrich Ebert Halle in Ludwigshafen on the 12th of April, the concert descended into a full-blown riot, and The Who kicked them off their tour. John's Children returned home to England. So for The Who to think they were overly boisterous, wow, that must have been some gig. And on the 29th of April 1967, he performed with John's Children at the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. And that was a British freak-out held at North London's Alexandra Palace. Some reports put 10,000 people joining this happening. It was in aid of UK counterculture's mouthpiece, the International Times. That was a great magazine, a bit like the Rolling Stone in America. It combined politics and music, but once again it was facing prosecution and needed money for its defence. And to get a flavour of the era, just listen to how a flyer at the time put it, and this is all in quotes. London's own hip newspaper, the International Times, presents giant benefit 14-hour Technicolor Dream, 30 top groups, kaleidoscopic colour, beautiful people, followed by a free be-in on Sunday. Tickets £1. The two-stage mixed media happening delivered light shows, music, poetry, and there was a whole host of people there. Pink Floyd, that'd be with Syd Barrett, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, The Move, Alexis Corner, Yoko Ono was there, The Pretty Things, Soft Machine, and the fabulous mod band The Creation. And apparently Pink Floyd delivered their set as dawn broke. Wow, what a night that would have been. And in May, they released Desdemona, which was the first John's Children single to feature guitarist Marc Bolan. And that again was written by Marc Bolan. But that all sort of fell apart with their next single in the July Midsummer Night's Scene. There was a whole load of disagreements going on, and they parted company. And that's when Marc Bolan got himself together with Steve Peregrine Tuck and formed Tyrannosaurus Rex. And they were a psychedelic folk duo. Initially, Tyrannosaurus Rex wasn't well received, I think it's fair to say, but they found a champion in DJ John Peel, legendary British DJ, and with his help, they soon garnered a strong underground following. And on the 19th of April 1968, they released their first single, Deborah, and that was produced by Tony Visconti. They only really had a cult following with Tyrannosaurus Rex. They entered the UK charts on the 8th of May 68 with that first single, and that gave them a number 34. Then in September came 1 Inch Rock, 28, the charts. And their third and final hit came in the August of 69 with King of Rumbling Spires, and that got them just 44. But then in 68, summer of 68, they released their first album. My people were fair and had sky in their hair, but now they're content to wear stars on their brows. What a fabulous title that is for an album. And John Peel, in fact, read the children's story on the album. Well, come the end of 69, Steve Peregrine moved on. He was replaced by Mickey Finn. And that was really when they transformed themselves into T.Rex. And interestingly enough, on the 21st of April 1970, Elton John made his debut solo concert, and he opened for Tyrannosaurus Rex at London's Roundhouse. In the September, Marc Bolan appeared at the first ever Glastonbury Festival, and that was farmer Michael Eavis, and he was inspired by the Bath Blues Festival. He thought, oh, this could be good for the coffers for the farm. Why don't I have a pop, folk and blues festival at my worthy farm in Hilton, Somerset? And as well as Marc Bolan quintessence were there Stackridge, Amazing Blondell, and around 1,500 people came to that first one, and once again that was just £1 a ticket. Well, fame came at last on the 24th of October 1970 when Ride a White Swan entered the UK charts. It was coupled with two songs on the B-side. Is It Summer and Summertime Blues? And that's very much Ride a White Swan, very much an early marker for British glam rock. Now, Summertime Blues may well be on the B-side because urban legend has it that Mark Feld, a young Marc Bolan, carried Eddie Cochran's guitar to his car, and that was waiting outside the Hackney Empire when Eddie Cochran was on his fateful last tour in 1960. Well, Marc Bolan really had some serious success now. Ride a White Swan got to number 2 and was in the charts for 20 weeks. That was followed in February 71 by Hot Love, gave him a number 1 for 6 weeks. And in the July, Get It On with another number 1, and that was there for 4 weeks. Marc Bolan was finally a star. Well, I thought it'd be great to listen to his first single from November 1965. It failed to trouble the charts then or since. And this is Marc Bolan with The Wizard. Well, on to our last hero, David Bowie. Now, he went through a myriad of bands and solo efforts throughout the 1960s, only to very, very nearly become a one-hit wonder. Now, he was born on the 8th of January 1947 as David Robert Jones in Brixton in London. And he started out as Davy or David Jones, and his first gig was with the Conrads in the middle of June 1962. And his first recording ever came about a year later in the August of 63 as part of the Conrads. And they were at Decca Studios in London's West Hampstead. He provided vocals and saxophone when they recorded I Never Dreamed. And that all sort of came to an end in the December. But by the middle of 1964, he was Davy Jones and the King Bees. And that's where he released his first ever single, Liza Jane, coupled with Louie Louie, Go Home. The A-side was based on Little Liza Jane, written by Countess Ada Delacour, from the 1916 comedy Come Out of the Kitchen. Well, that sounds like a lot of laughs. And the B-side, of course, was a cover of Paul Revere and the Raiders' 1964 single, Louis Go Home. Now, shortly afterwards, he finds himself in the Mannish Boys. And on the 14th of June, the Mannish Boys auditioned for Opportunity Knocks. That was a TV talent show, very much a sort of forerunner of Britain's Got Talent. And apparently they passed the audition, but turned it down as uncool, not the place for hip people to be. And he was back in the TV studios in the November of '64. And this time it was for an interview with Cliff Mitchellmore on the Tonight programme. And that was because Bowie had founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. And that clip can be seen very easily on the internet. It's well worth a watch. And then by early '65, he was Davy Jones and the Mannish Boys. And they made their first TV appearance, again on BBC Two this time, on a wonderfully titled programme called Gadzooks, It's All Happening. They performed I Pity the Fool. That's an original from Bobby Blue Bland. It gave him a R&B #1 in 1961. An urban myth has it that the BBC told the band they need to get a haircut before they'd be allowed to perform, but obviously Anti-Beeb relented on that one. Around the same time, the whole lower third thing was coming together. Now, in the March of '65, Steve Marriott and the Small Faces were starting out, and he auditioned for the lower third, but lost out to David Bowie. So somewhere in a parallel universe, there's a rock and roll world without the Small Faces, and a much sadder world it would be. But the 16th of September 1965, he announced to the world that Davy Jones had changed his name to David Bowie. And he took the inspiration for the name from the American frontiersman and Alamo legend, and indeed knife legend, Jim Bowie, sometimes pronounced Jim Bowie. And he also wanted to avoid confusion with the monkeys, the British monkey, Davy Jones. And David Bowie in the lower third released Can't Help Thinking About Me at the beginning of 1966. It was actually the first single as David Bowie, written by Bowie, as most of his material was, even in those early days. And sort of a month later, he was in yet another band, Buzz. They kicked off in the February, and they released a single, and that was just as David Bowie. That was Do Anything You Say on the Pie label. And interestingly enough, Buzz played on the record, but for some reason they weren't credited. And things came to an end with Buzz at the end of 1966. But a lot like Rod Stewart, David Bowie was very keen to try for solo success while he was still involved with various bands. And on the 2nd of December 66, he released Rubber Band, and that was his first single on Derham. Now, 3 months later, he was with the Riot Squad. Now, the Riot Squad was a very, very well-respected R&B band. They'd come together in 1964 and included Mitch Mitchell in the original lineup. That was Mitch Mitchell of Jimi Hendrix Experience fame, of course, the drummer there. And he was only with them till mid-65, so they never actually played together, Mitchell and Bowie. But he was with Riot Squad long enough to be part of the recording sessions in the spring of 1967 when they recorded Toy Soldier, Silly Blue Boy, I'm Waiting for the Man, the Lou Reed song, and the wonderfully titled Silver Treetop School for Boys. Party company with the Riot Squad in the May of 67. And around that sort of time, again, he was having a go at solo success, this time with the notorious, legendary, well, choose your own adjective, Laughing Gnome. Again, he's still with Derham at this stage, produced by Mike Vernon. But that's the one where he sounds unbelievably like Anthony Newley and a West End musical, basically. It's certainly all happening in the summer of 1967. That's when he released his first album. He's still with Derham, and that was just called David Bowie. He wrote all 14 songs, played sax and guitar. And at the end of the year, he decided that the theatre was a good place to be. And at the Oxford New Theatre, he was Cloud in Lindsay Kemp's mime, Puero in Turquoise, which really leads nicely into his next band. By mid-68, he was performing as part of Turquoise, later renamed to Feathers. And they were a sort of folk music trio, poetry and dance, mixed media. They recorded the wonderfully titled Chingling in October, and they all sort of went their separate ways at the end of the year. And that brings us really into the world of Space Oddity. In the January of '69, they started recording the Love You Till Tuesday, and that was a 30-minute film intended to bring Bowie to a wider audience, again on Derham, and it wasn't released until 1984. But the Space Oddity we know and love, of course, is on Philips. That was released in the July of '69 and featured Rick Wakeman as the session keyboards guy. But he was very, very nearly a one-hit wonder, was Mr. Bowie. Between Space Oddity and his next UK hit, Starman, there was nearly 3 years, and it was after Starman that he gained the ongoing success. I mean, Space Oddity entered the UK charts on the 6th of September '69, made number 5. Starman didn't actually chart until the 24th of June 1972, reached number 10, and by now he was on RCA. And this is when the Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars album was released. That spent 106 weeks in the charts. We can very much thank British glam rock for sustaining David Bowie, because without that he may well have been a one-hit wonder. Well, that's it for another show. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show, and the story of what Eric Clapton, Rod Stewart, Marc, Bolan and David Bowie, what they were all up to before they were famous. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, please check me out on Twitter at RNR Unraveled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. And if you can see a theme developing here, remember you can win a copy of my book. Well, that's a signed copy of my book. Rock and Roll Unraveled. That question again. Who did Eric Clapton replace as lead guitarist in the Yardbirds in 1963? To enter, simply go to the website rockandrollunraveled.com, contact, send me an email with the answer, and I'll announce the winner on the next show. I'll post the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unraveled. Now, to play us out, we're going back to 1965, and this is Davy Jones. And he released on the 20th of August a single called You've Got a Habit of Leaving, and it was produced by Shel Talmy. He's the guy who produced all the early Who singles, and to put that into context, the Who released their first single in the January of '65. That was I Can't Explain. And he's actually with the Lower Third here, but for some reason they're not credited on the label. It was a month after this particular single was released that the press announcement came that Davy Jones was now David Bowie. So this is Davy Jones to play us out with an uncredited Lower Third, and You've Got a Habit of Leaving.